It's a very warm welcome to all our viewers and welcome to a new edition of Africa Today, our show bringing you all the latest news and events from all around the African continent. My name is Angie Meher, and as usual we begin straight away with some of the news making the headlines, where President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi received on Tuesday General Turki Gulak, the security advisor to South Sudan's president. The meeting was attended by the General Intelligence Chief Lieutenant Abbas Kamel. During the meeting, the South Sudanese security advisor handed President el-Sisi a message from President Salva Kiir. Message reviewed means of boosting bilateral ties as well as the latest developments in Sudan. Meeting also discussed efforts to settle the crises and the security of the Sudanese people, as well as humanitarian and political challenges in the country. Both sides stressed the importance of urging Sudanese sides to keep the truce and move to a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire. They said the permanent ceasefire would allow humanitarian aid into the country, as well as open the path for a constructive dialogue to settle the crisis and continue with the transitional path and political process to keep the unity of Sudan. And still with more news about Sudan, the number of people displaced by violence within the country has more than doubled in the last week to over 700,000 people amid the ongoing fighting between the military factions. The statement was made by the International Organization for Migration spokesperson on Tuesday. We have the details in this report.
The spokesperson for the International Organization for Migration said the number of people internally displaced in Sudan has more than doubled in the last week. Speaking at a press conference in Geneva, the IOM's Paul Dillon said over 700,000 people have been displaced amid ongoing fighting between military factions. Last week, the UN agency said that around 340,000 people were internally displaced. Aid workers say fighting between rival military factions in Sudan is pushing poorly funded humanitarian programs in the region to a breaking point. Even before the violence began on April 15, millions of people in Sudan and neighboring countries were dependent on aid due to poverty and conflict. Since then, hundreds have been killed, including at least 5 humanitarians. Food stocks have been looted, and many international aid workers have left. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, is seeking an additional $445 million to cope with an expected exodus of 860,000 people to 6 of Sudan's 7 neighbors: Chad, Egypt, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan and Central African Republic by October.
We're now delighted to be joined over the telephone by His Excellency Ambassador Gamal Bayoumi, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. It's a very good afternoon to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for joining us. I'm very well indeed. And let me start by asking you, Mr. Ambassador, how do you see, the flurry of diplomatic activity by different African states, of course, headed by Egypt, to settle some of the latest developments in the African continent as a whole, especially in the region?
We are doing all what we can do to help our African brothers, especially in the neighboring countries like Sudan, like Libya, and in order to have a sort of consensus among the African countries, especially the neighbor countries to Sudan. We are talking now to Chad. Sameh Shukri is in Chad. He will be visiting also South Sudan. And we have to coordinate all the efforts in order to help our Sudanese brothers. It is a disastrous thing that a country can be invaded by a foreign force, but the problem in Sudan that the military force, which is the safeguard of the country, is splitting among 2 factions, and they are fighting each other. This is a highly complicated situation, and it needs Egypt, because Egypt has always direct relations with all the persons and all the tribes of Sudan.
Yes.
Mind you, that Sudan and Egypt were one country in my generation, and we look to Sudan as if it is part of our heart. So I hope that this will lead us to better situation and to lead the Sudanese to come to reason and to stop fighting each other, because this is a disastrous situation.
Indeed.
And here we are calling on our neighbors and brothers in Africa, maybe they can give additional effort in order to settle the matter, especially the immediate border of Sudan, because if hundreds of thousands are leaving Sudan to Egypt, to Chad, and to South Sudan.
Right. Mr. Ambassador, how do you see, cooperation between Egypt as well as other African countries in this regard, helping reach a ceasefire that you're discussing, as well as, allowing the country to go back on its developmental path?
It is a very strong cooperation, and it's direct between the leaders immediately on the level of the foreign ministers and the concerned ministers also. And we don't have any obstacle to stop us from calling on all our brothers in Africa in order to help us and to help Sudan in this situation. Our relations in Africa and the Egyptian face, as you well know, is the most accepted face in Africa. We are part of the continent. We have a long history with the continent. Many African countries would tell you that they are proud that they have Egyptian origin, because the Egyptians went through the continent everywhere. And now we are the most represented country in Africa. We have an embassy everywhere in Africa, so we do not lack at all the ways and the means of direct contacts.
Absolutely. Mr. Ambassador, now, how do you see such challenges and other challenges in the region, aside from Sudan, highlight the importance of, more Nile Basin development cooperation between these countries?
I am amazed, rather than I am sorry, that we always were complaining that there are foreign forces trying to attack us, or there are a sort of theory of conspiracy against us. Now the problem is coming from us. The problem is us, the Sudanese, or the Libyans, or other countries. The Somalis are fighting each other since decades. So who can help here to make a citizen feel that he belongs to Sudan or Nigeria or Somalia, not to his tribe, Hausa or Pafia or whatever the tribe is? It is difficult in Africa, I am convinced, but the Egyptian experience that you are Egyptian wherever you live, in Aswan or in Alexandria, but this is not the situation in Africa, unfortunately. Because the system, the state system is relatively new to the African countries. We're still trying, we're still hoping that they will listen to reason, that they will be in a better situation if they vote for the country, not for the tribe.
Another issue, Mr. Ambassador, lots of investments have been pouring into the African continent, and even Egyptian investments in Africa themselves have increased, reaching $10.2 billion. How would you describe this move for further investments in Africa in light of the current situation in the continent, and how, important is stability and security to further on these investments which are needed in this current global period of time?
Good question, because as a matter of fact, trade and investment will add to the stability reasons. Those who have work to do, those who are trading, those who are investing, those who are enjoying employment from the projects of investment, they don't think about fighting each other. They will continue working. So this is another formula that we are trying to bring investments, whether from the Arab dimension or the Chinese, they agreed with us, or Japan, since our president visited Japan on the occasion of the TICAD conference. Europe is encouraging us to do that. So investment is a very important weapon for stability in Africa. But still we have a long way to go.
What would you say is one of the biggest challenges impeding such investments and intra-African state collaboration on an economic front?
Yes, this is another dimension which is going quite good. Egypt started by joining what we call the common market of East and South Africa,
Yes,
COMESA.
COMESA.
There were 20-something countries. And during the chairmanship of President Sisi to the African Union in 2019, we initiate a new initiative to have a large African free trade area
Yes.
of the 50 countries of Africa. This certainly will encourage much more closer relations between the African countries. And in the Egyptian experience, it is very positive because since we joined COMESA in 2009, in 1996.
1996,
Our
yes.
trade with Africa is 4 times the size of that time. And we make a good surplus in our trade balance. So the experience is very good. And now we are calling on investors to come to invest in Egypt, because if you invest in Egypt, then you have the treatment of free trade area in Africa, in the Arab world, and in the European Union also. So our market in Egypt is not attracting somebody who's seeking 100 million consumers, but we have 2,000 million consumers in the 3 dimensions of the Arabs, Africa, and European Union.
Indeed. This free trade agreement, Mr. Ambassador, that the Egyptian president pioneered during his presidency of the African Union has been signed by most of the African nations, and now steps are being done in order to make it a reality on the ground. Your opinion, what are some of the most logistic, challenges that face African countries in order to reach this agreement and fully implement it?
Good question. We asked this to some European parliamentarians who were visiting me lately. And during the meeting, some Egyptian businessmen asked them, what are the challenges you are facing whenever you invest in our countries? They say generally in the whole region, in the whole developing countries, bureaucracy is the main enemy. It is very complicated, and they ask you for this and that, which is not necessary at all. Second, banking system is not first-class banking system, although Egypt explored a lot of efforts in order to implement Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, which is the mark for good banking system. Exchange rate is another obstacle. Our ports need to be widening because our ports cannot, in Africa in general, cannot receive big ships, and this costs a lot. Transport, now we are thinking seriously of establishing a road highway from Alexandria till Johannesburg. This will help a lot. Many things we have to do.
And there was the old rail project from Cape to Cairo as well, which has been a dream, really.
Add to this that the mass media is not helping us. One of a sudden we fell in love with government projects. We do not believe anymore in the private sector. No, the president himself, lately he stressed the importance of the individuals and the private sector.
Indeed, and the private sector has a very large role to play as well in intra-African, trade.
Absolutely.
You spoke about the issue of infrastructural developments. The Chinese have come into Africa in order to invest in their infrastructure. We've seen rails and roads done by, Chinese initiatives. And also many other African countries are working towards improving the road networking as well in order to enable easier access between African countries for their trade ties. Would this make a big difference in your opinion, Mr. Ambassador? Would it speed up the situation?
I hope that many Egyptians, not even Africans, I hope that many Egyptians would be listening to you now. Because many Egyptians on the Facebook and on the mass media, they are questioning why we are building all these roads, to do what? We need to eat, we need hospitals, we need schools. But roads are bad to their taste. The president lately, he said, if you want to import, how you import without ports? How you import without roads? How you export your production without having very good roads and very good ports?
Yes.
How do you produce without good electricity and good communication system? So infrastructure, of course, is the base for any development plan.
Absolutely right. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Gamal Bayoumi, the former assistant to the Foreign Minister. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and your insight, and for joining us on our edition of Africa Today, and still bringing you more news from the African continent. More dead bodies were still being recovered on Monday from 2 villages in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where floods have killed more than 400 people last week in one of the country's deadliest disasters in recent history. We have the details in this story.
Many dazed survivors of Congo's flood disaster were mourning multiple family members killed in the flash floods that swept away entire homes and buried the villages of Bushushu and Nyamukubi, both in South Kivu province, in mud and debris. Humanitarian workers have spent days recovering mud-caked bodies from the wrecked villages in Kalehe territory, where days of torrential rain triggered landslides and caused rivers to break their banks on Thursday. The large number of casualties has meant workers have had to bury victims in freshly dug mass graves. South Kivu Governor Theo Nyabiji Kasi said earlier on Monday that just over 400 people are now confirmed dead, more than doubling the toll since Friday. Civil society sources on the ground expect it to rise further as bodies were still floating in rivers and buried under wreckage. Hundreds of people remain unaccounted for, according to the UN. The Congolese Red Cross said that 274 people had been buried so far, including 98 women and 82 children. Over 8,800 others have been impacted by the floods, which swept away homes and schools and cut off roads. Destroyed sewage systems and bodies lying in debris are raising concerns about sanitation. Families have been separated and traumatized survivors are taking refuge in other people's homes.
With this final report, we wrap up today's edition of Africa Today. We do hope you have enjoyed it. Do join us again tomorrow, just after 2 p.m. for a new episode. Till then, you're in the company of myself, Angie Meher. Thank you for watching.